Hello everyone, I'm Lale, and today I will present my research on Rawls' ideal theory, which is In Search of the Just, Reflection on Rawls' ideal theory. Before I start, I'd like to thank my mentor, Will, who supported me throughout the program, answered all my questions patiently. So thank you, Will. Thank you for your support, and thank you for your patience. Moving on to the overview. To give it today, I will I will give a brief background on Rawls and what is ideal theory, why we needed ideal theory, why I defended the ideal theory on my paper, how ideal theory build a realistic utopia, what elements of Rawls' theory is realistic utopia, and concluded afterwards. So begin, John Rawls published his book, A Theory of Justice in 1971, which sparked a lot of controversies, mainly because he established a society, what he calls a just society, the ideal theory, where there's strict compliance, where every citizen follow the established rules, obey. A society that runs under favorable conditions. There are no negative factors, no non-ideal factors, as I said, that there are no starvation, war, theft, anything that comes to mind, disobedience of the citizens. He eliminated all these factors, established what he calls strict compliance, and says that, as I said, that there are principles established by the people and they follow and obey these principles. The principles that mentioned here is the true principle of justice. The true principle of justice, the first one is each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive scheme of equal basic liberties. And second is social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they're both reasonably expected to be everyone's advantage. So with these two principles, he also formed what he called the difference principle, which, as it says, that the social economic inequalities exist, but the distribution of good and wealth should be made that in a way even the least well off of the least well off of the society must be benefited, and that after the distribution, its situation shouldn't be worsened but get better. To imagine a scenario where there are group A, B, and C, and there are certain inequalities between these two groups, and like in every society. But after the distribution made, even though this inequalities continues and group C never gets this economic situation like group A and B, it still get better off of the distribution and not worsen. So by establishing these three principles in a way, strict compliance, true principle of justice, and a difference principle, he established what he calls a just society. With this just society, an ideal theory arise, and also another question arise. Okay, so we have this perfect institution that are just, that are citizens that obey the rules, they follow the rules, there's no negative factors, as we said, crime, starvation, wars, and all that. So how can it benefit to us? What's the goal of the ideal theory? In two ways, I argue that ideal theory is actually essential for society as well as in political philosophy. First, by removing all these non-ideal factors, we can see more clearly, we can get a more clear picture. Okay, so this is the just society looks like. So where did we fail? In a way, I adopted Eslin's template model to see with adopting a template model, we started a philosophical investigation to see where the reality, our society, fails to live up to the ideal. What can we do to get our institutions better? So there are the institutions. These are the institution ideal theory that work justly. So what can we do for our society and for our institution and for people to get closer to the ideal? In that way, this is also attached to the second argument that ideal theory serves as a guide. So throughout the history, people always look for a certain guide to shape their behavior, shape their laws, their institution. Even though this guide changed, the idea, that need of guide never changed. So in that way, ideal theory serves to be a guide to show people this is the ideal, this is the just society, this is where you should get, and this is where you fail. So this also leads up to a realistic utopia. In that sense, one of the reasons that first, let's say that establish what realistic utopia is. Realistic utopia is what we can say both imaginable and attainable. So when we form this ideal theory, just society, it's not too utopic. It's not detached from reality. It's not something that we can never get there. We can never get to be a just society. No, by building a realistic utopia, which is what ideal theory is, we have both realistic elements and utopic elements to both help us to see where we failed and what parts we accept as utopic, so that we know where we failed. So this is the elements that if we eliminate these elements, this is where what we get. So this is the problem in our hands. So I argued that in two parts that in a way that Rawls' theory is a realistic utopia. One, what makes the theory of utopic is the strict compliance, where citizens follow and obey this established principles, the true principle of justice that I mentioned before. What makes it realistic is a difference principle, because it recognizes the inequalities and establish a principle where after the distribution of good and wealth, the least well off get better. So in a way, this is a realistic look from Rawls that it recognizes the inequalities in society. It also gives this utopic part. So in that way, we can see what utopic and what realistic, and why with accepting this utopic form, what we have is this clear picture of society where we fail and where we can get better. So this leads out to the objections. So like in every philosophical argument, like discussion, of course, there are certain objections to the ideal theory. What I address the objection is the realist, especially Roman Goy's objection. There are two objections. First is the exclusion of ethics. Goy says that the politics need to be realist, so we don't need these ethical problems. So I answer this objection in a way, so okay, let's us exclude the ethics, all this moral question, the citizens that are lead with moral and ethical decision with this moral instincts. So this is brings to the table. So how can we eliminate something more that is fundamental for people and society? No matter how you want to eliminate the ethical problems or this applied ethics thing, there is always this question in society: what is ethical things to do? What is moral things to do? That's what our law is established in a way. So I argued that this is where the realists fail, because we cannot exclude completely the idea of ethics, our moral and ethics instinct in a way, the decision process. To address the second objection is Goy's main objection is the need of taking real situation action seriously. There is this incoherence of the people and the institutions, and we can't really accept strict compliance. That would be too utopic. And we need to build this realistic political and social agents on this incoherence of people, this self-delusional, confused people, the state of incoherence. We need to establish the political institutions. So the question arises from here: all right, but how can you establish a good society, a just institutions, and how can you establish this on incoherence? So my objection to Vaughan's objection was it is almost impossible to accept that incoherence and build something on that. By accepting this utopic part of the ideal theory, we actually accept the coherent society to get a clear picture. So this is where it actually fails in a way. The second objection is we can actually build something on incoherence. So this is actually as a brief explanation of my paper, is that ideal theory is essentiality for people in that way, because it's identified both humankind's limitation and potential, serving as a guide. How can we become a just? How can we get better? And it also to give this example, society that is both imaginable and achievable in a way to be a realistic utopia. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for your time. See you.
Hi, my name is Eric, and I will be exploring the effects of vertical integration through the eBay acquisition of PayPal. So first, I want to cover very briefly what vertical integration is. It is basically a part of the supply chain being owned by a company, from a company acquiring it. In this case, it's eBay acquiring PayPal. So this benefits the company because the supplier's goods have no unnecessary transaction in between the company, making it much easier to incorporate the supply. So I want to talk about a little bit of background for eBay. It was founded in 1995 by Pierre Omidyar, and in 2002, it controlled 96% of the online auction market, and most transactions on eBay were PayPal based. At the time of the acquisition, eBay tried to incorporate its own online payment method through BillPoint, but that was met with the consumers not really liking it. It was a little clunky, and they overall just much preferred PayPal much more. It had a few competitors like Swoopo, but Swoopo couldn't really compete with the dominant eBay presence, and they had to focus on specific categories like electronics. And they finally acquired PayPal in 2002 because consumers just thought it was easier. A little PayPal background. It was founded by Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, Ken Howery, Luke Nosek, and Yu Pan. There's a famous PayPal mafia where many people who worked in PayPal ended up founding their own companies that were very successful, like Elon Musk, famous for Tesla and SpaceX, Russell Simmons for Yelp, and Reid Hoffman for LinkedIn. PayPal was founded in 1998, and it was a new way to pay for goods online. It was extremely efficient because you just needed to sign up with your email and you could start making transactions. In 2013, they acquired Braintree and Venmo, but then they split in 2015 from eBay. So how did this acquisition affect consumers? Consumers liked the change to PayPal. They thought it was more efficient and easier because before they had to mail in cash checks, cash or checks, which would basically take weeks or months to register, because they had to cash in the check and then see if it bounces, and then they could send the goods. But now, with the push of a button, the transaction was done and you could send your item like straight away, which was really efficient for online auctions. How did it affect the market? So the network effect basically boosted PayPal's user count after it was incorporated into eBay. PayPal rose to the biggest online payments provider of the time. Other companies really tried to emulate the success of PayPal. Direct Pay was one of them by Yahoo, but they couldn't really compete with PayPal and eBay, so they shut down in 2004. Basically the same thing from C2It by Citigroup. They had 200,000 people, but it was nothing compared to the 30 million that PayPal had. So in 2004, it just wasn't getting enough internet traction, so it shut down as well. The only thing that was a downside of PayPal was that it was a little clunky to use and for transactions, but in 2002, it was really good already. But it offered a door for new payment providers in the future to basically become more efficient. And that's where we got Stripe and Venmo, which are very easy to use, user-friendly interface, and they incorporate into websites very easily. So the growth and future of this acquisition was that the PayPal basically grew to be the biggest online payments platform in the world. They supported over 100 different forms of currency worldwide. and they became really huge. In 2013, they acquired Braintree, which is the company with the subsidiary Venmo, which really took off during quarantine. In 2015, they split from eBay, and eBay decided to use a Dutch counterpart in order to pay for online things. In 2020, there was a stock boom for PayPal because many people were transferring from credit cards and cash all the way to online payments through PayPal, Venmo, and other forms of online payments, which really boosted them in the stock market. But in 2021, they crashed really, really hard. Also, they acquired a company that's called Pay Later, Buy Now, Pay Later, and it basically allowed them to defer payments to later, which turned into PayPal credit. So what would happen if eBay and PayPal did not merge? It basically has an open gateway for all online payments. Everything's up for grabs, but PayPal would still be predominantly supplying eBay, and it would maybe have a shift from PayPal to other payments platforms, which maybe would be better or more efficient. Or maybe eBay would merge with another payments platform. You never know. But this would also open the door for PayPal to have independent growth. However, I do not think that they would grow as big as they would be with eBay, and maybe they wouldn't really be able to acquire these other companies like Braintree and eventually have PayPal credit. So that's the end of my slides. Thanks.
Hello everyone, my name is Darian, and this is my research project on measuring the effects of the pandemic on music practicing time and motivation under my mentor, Caleb Bleja. The COVID-19 pandemic had a large impact on everyone in the world, as it forced the world to shut down. However, it had especially significant impacts on musicians and artists. Such as having remote performances and lessons, fewer opportunities for work, and having their motivation fluctuate, especially in terms of practice time. In order to better measure these variables, I devised this research project with the goal of measuring the effects of the pandemic on classical musicians' practice time, their feelings of motivation, and their feelings of threat. For our methods, we did this by issuing a voluntary anonymous survey, which collected data on the following three variables. The first one was amount of practice hours per week, which was measured in three time periods. The first was before the pandemic, which was before January 30th, 2020, when the WHO declared COVID-19 a actual pandemic. During the pandemic, which was from January 30th to 2020, January 30th, 2020 to June 15th, 2021, which was when California lifted the lockdown restrictions, and after the pandemic, which was June 15th, 2021 to the present. Our second variable was feelings of motivation, and this was measured on 7-point Likert scales in terms of agreeability on statements such as, I didn't practice because I really felt that I was wasting my time. In this case, a higher score on the Likert scale would indicate a lower motivation score. Lastly, we measured feelings of threat in a similar way to feelings of motivation, which was on a 7-point Likert scale based on agreeability on statements such as, I felt threatened by a possible viral infection and disease of my loved ones. And in this case, a higher score on the Likert scale would indicate a higher threat score. For our demographics, we received 85 participants overall, which we sorted into three categories. So our first category was instrument group, which we found we had 3 percussionists, 31 keyboardists, 25 strings, and 26 wind players. As you can see here, we had a relatively even spread regarding winds, strings, and keyboards, with percussionists being the outlier. We also categorized their age into ranges, which we found we had from 1 to 15 years old, we had 35 responses. From 16 to 21 years old, we had 42 responses. And from 22 to 66 years old, we had 8 responses. Lastly, we also sorted the participants in terms of gender. For males, we received 35 responses. For females, we received 47 responses. And for others, we received 3 responses. Let's move on to the main results. So regarding our first variable, which was practice time, we took the mean number of hours practiced for each time period measured before, during, and after the pandemic. And as you can see here, we found that there were no significant trends or increases or decreases from before, during, and after the pandemic among all instrument groups. However, if we looked a little closer within the instrument categories, we could see a couple not very significant trends. However, they do exist within the instrument groups. For instance, percussionists, we can see that they exclusively increased their practice hours from pre to post COVID, while other groups such as wind instruments, exclusively decreased from pre to post COVID. However, overall, there were not very significant trends to be found in terms of practice time pre to post COVID. For our second variable of motivation, we found a weak positive correlation on practice time, as you can see in our first scatter plot on the left, which measured hours practiced versus the motivation score. Our motivation score was found by averaging the responses to motivation related questions on our survey by averaging Likert scale scores. There was also a negative correlation to be found with musical experience, and this was verified by an R value of negative 0.218 and a P value of 0.045, meaning that it's significant because the P is less than 0.045. This is seen in our scatter plot to the right here. And the negative correlation indicates that the more years of musical experience you have, actually, the less amount of motivation you have. For our third variable of threat and uncertainty, we could find that there was a mean threat score of only 4.3, which means that to classical musicians, threat was not a very large variable, a very large factor to any results over the pandemic. However, we did find a weak positive correlation with practice hours, as you can see here in the scatter plot below, of R is equal to 0.125 and P value of 0.256, meaning it's not very significant, but you can still see it in the scatter plot. Lastly, we saw that there were overall little effects on results as a whole, as there were multiple p-values that were all over 0.05, such as 0.473 or 0.582. For additional results, aside from the 3 main variables, we also asked about lesson format. So when asked about the effectiveness of lesson format, almost all of the participants rated in-person lessons higher than remote lessons in terms of effectiveness, with the mean of each effectiveness score having a difference of 2, with in-person lessons having a score of 2 higher than remote lessons on average. This indicated that they really thought that in-person lessons were more effective than remote lessons. We also measured age and gender as shown in our demographics, which were both subjected to t-tests and regression tests. However, neither had significant impacts on other variables from what we could find based on the p-values being greater than 0.05. For discussion, overall practice time did not really change, remained relatively similar between before, during, and after the pandemic. And feelings of threat and uncertainty also did not impact practice time, with p-values of greater than 0.05. As you can see, we had a mean threat score of 4.3, which means that classical musicians really didn't feel very strongly on feelings of threat over the pandemic. And lastly, for motivation, we found that it did not heavily affect practice time. However, it did have negative correlation with musical experience, with an R value of negative 0.218 and a P value of 0.045, indicating that it is a significant finding. We also found, of course, that for lesson format, remote lessons were considered way less effective by classical musicians than in-person lessons. And we also found that age and gender did not have a significant impacts on results. For our limitations to this paper, we could find that our survey was made up of voluntary response samples. So that meant that only participants that chose to fill out the survey had their data collected. This could lead to some internal bias in terms of results. Our second limitation was that we had a relatively small sample size of only 85 participants. This could make applying our findings to a larger population a little harder. Third is that the survey results were self-reported, which meant that there could be some inaccuracies within the responses, as it was only self-reported. Our last limitation was that we had a centered age demographic, which meant that almost all of our responses were from the age range of 15 to 17, which means that our findings may be harder to apply to a larger population. For future research, we have 3 steps that we could take. Our first would be to attain a larger sample size to make it more clear whether our findings could be applied to a larger population. Second would be to ask more specific questions, especially in terms of relationships between variables, such as asking more specifically whether feelings of motivation impacted your practice hours or practice schedule. Lastly, we would perform more research in terms of variables that have previously been unexplored, such as years of musical experience and lesson format. Thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, contact me at darianlee2014@gmail.com. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Reena, and today I'm going to be talking about the contemporary impacts of teaching antebellum slavery and the Holocaust. And we're going to be going through this through 4 different subsections, the first being the background. Now, we all know that the Civil War ended in the Union's victory, and the 13th Amendment freed the slaves after a century's worth of struggle. Now, after the war, groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, as seen in the picture, worked to rewrite the legacy of the Confederacy through the lost cause, and they were seeking to influence education in the future. Now, the Holocaust, on the other hand, occurred half a century after the Civil War. Germany saw the rise of National Socialists led by Hitler, and over the course of World War II, the Nazis would systematically kill 11 million Jews, members of the LGBTQ+ community, and prisoners of war while facing forcing thousands of others into ghettos. After the war ended, the Nuremberg trials initiated the process of denazification in Germany, and they aimed to delegitimize the authority of the regime. Now, there are going to be three important terms I'm going to be covering today. The first is the lost cause, which is the Southern Confederate interpretation of the American Civil War. The next is Sekundarstufe, which is a German secondary school education system that comprises of 3 different levels. And the last is Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is a German word that loosely translates to working off the past and refers to Germany's efforts to interrogate the atrocities of the Holocaust. Now, the two countries address the sensitive topics very differently. In the US, they have recently seen growing attention to the prevalence of the lost cause narrative of many of their Southern schools' curricula. Unlike Germany, there's no standardized history curricula in the States. Because the history of slavery is ugly, many of us don't like to talk about it. And we instead like to talk about the good people, the abolitionists, and people who ran away to freedom. We instead like to leave out the details of what exactly they were fleeing. For example, it wasn't until 2018 that the Texas State School Board decided that the public school curricula should start emphasizing slavery as a primary cause of the Civil War. We still see these worksheets from Texas and the mock slave auction in North Carolina in the 21st century. There have, however, been attempts to better educate students on the history of marginalized communities in school curriculas. In early 2022, AP announced their intention to introduce an AP African American Studies course as their first ethnic studies program ever to be offered. Now, in Germany, teachers have a great flexibility within their classrooms. However, it is within broader history curriculum guidelines. The curriculum guide for Sekundarstufe mandates that all schools highlight the Holocaust as a primary topic of conversation, and to include conversations of the Holocaust within the context of the students' own communities. They emphasize the importance of remembrance through covering topics like the process of industrialized murder of Auschwitz, totalitarian dictatorship, genocide, dehumanization, and concentration camp experiences. And all this content is covered through group projects, documentary films, class discussions, eyewitness accounts, and field trips. Now, there's also differences in the presentation of these topics within the textbooks. For Germany, it wasn't until the 1990s that the Holocaust education became a mandatory topic for textbooks and curricula. Within all 3 levels of the Sekundarstufe in the 21st century, history textbooks have to confront the history of the Holocaust and emphasize the importance of repenting and understanding the brutality of what happened. Within these textbooks, history is cultivated with the system of values consistent with UNESCO and the Council of Europe. Now, students rarely encounter concepts of the enemy, and the textbooks emphasize that the sheer magnitude of the Holocaust requires a complicity or knowledge of large segments of the German population. Books like When Hitler Stole the Pink Rabbit is meant to provide a basic understanding of the Holocaust to primary school children. For the US, after the Civil War, the lost cause narrative gave way to modern civil rights movements. Recently, in an effort to increase diversity and inclusion, US textbooks have added the stories of previously silent groups. But in doing so, they have obscured a clear narrative about the Civil War. In many American textbooks, the complexity of the diverse identities that are scattered within the US social landscape is very different than that of the US. Unlike in Germany, where textbooks primarily focus on the roles of the perpetrators and the victims of the Holocaust, textbooks in the States include perspectives from communities that extend beyond the people who are directly involved, which makes it extremely complicated. However, the more extreme examples centered primarily around the American South are demonstrated in the textbook's Prentice Hall classics, which include sentences like, while there were cruel masters who maimed or even killed their slaves, there were also kind and generous owners. Now, this demonstrates that the problematic mindset still exists despite movements toward equality. Now, legislations and political agendas heavily influence the education of younger generations. Constituents habitually see changes in educational curricula alongside transitions of power and changes in political leadership. In the US, the end of the Civil War was not the end of racial discrimination. While most people believed in the abolishment of slavery, the majority of the American population still upheld their beliefs about white supremacy. The lost cause narrative permeated into Northern textbooks and curricula as time progressed. Additionally, white supremacist values echoed through the descendants of the Confederacy. We can see this in the banning of the critical race theory in multiple schools across the South and the promoting of their lost cause narrative. Within regions such as the South, because of the lack of rigid history curricula, education include ideologies that reflect the society of which they serve. In Germany, similar to the States, in the period immediately following the war, Germans cast themselves as victims and distanced their involvement in the war. It was the grassroots movement that fueled the rise of Vergangenheitsbewältigung and the unearthing of abandoned concentration camps and torture chambers that would serve as crucial field trip destination for school children as part of their education. Unlike in the US, the production, distribution, the display of the Nazi-era symbol and the Nazi flag and the Hitler salute is illegal, only with the exception only being towards education. Now, in conclusion, there's a lot to be learned about a country when we explore the ways in which they educate the younger generation about these chapters of their history. The US and Germany address the destructive legacy of those past very differently, with the US often attempting to downplay or even at times rewrite the brutal legacy and ongoing marginalization of people of color. Germany appears to have dealt with their post-Holocaust legacy in a much more frank and culpable manner, working to actively denazify the nation and enforcing laws against the public replication of Nazi eliminationist ideologies. But why is this topic important? The United States and Germany are not the only countries that struggle with dealing with the shameful chapters of their past. With the rise of civil rights movements in the 21st century, countries like South Africa has mandated the teaching of colonialism and apartheid from grades 7 to 9. In 2015, Canada instructed that the history of residential schools be taught to all of their students. Even though it's cliche, people who don't understand history are doomed to repeat it. The US and Germany are very prominent examples in the 21st century whose successes and failures we can all learn from. Thank you for listening to my presentation.